In this video, we're going to talk about the finer details of marrying the composition API with Vue. And essentially, what I want you to go away with at the end of this video is some ideas of how you can make your code look a lot cleaner by taking advantage of a lot of what the composition API and specifically actually script setup and some of the macros have to offer. So we're also going to go this is going to be a bit of a deep dive also in how the composition API works in relation to Vue components. So, what's vModel actually doing, and how can we use the new define model by Vue, that new macro, to make things a lot easier for pulling our components apart. Okay, anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm using the modular quasar template in this video. You don't even need to know what that is. You can just go ahead and start a new Vue project. I'm using it just because it's what I'm used to when I create Vue apps. So let's jump into the index page, and I'll go ahead and bring npm install. Another L there. Yep, and now we can say pdev. P is just an alias for pnpm because I use it all the time. And let's go ahead and run that. And I'll also open my browser here and control click that to get it open. Now, the first thing I want to show you is basically how props work and how emits work. And you might already know how they work, but I want to add a few layers on top of the knowledge that you might already have. So for example, the fact that we're not supposed to mutate props and what we do to essentially avoid mutating props. So let's come up here and say const some value is equal to ref, and we'll make that an empty string. By the way, I've got auto import here, which is why I don't have to import ref there. That's just part of the modular quasar template. And now we'll come in here and we'll say some component. And we need to go ahead and build that as well. So let's say hydrogen new component. Or maybe it's hydrogen component new. By the way, this is also part of the modular quasar template, being able to create components in this way. And it's for a module, and we'll make this for the user module because that's the only one we get by default. And I'll call it some user component. Because the modular quasar template, and I need a better name for that. I'm thinking about calling it, template blue or something like that. Modular blue or quasar blue. Quasar blue is probably a better name. So it's going to enforce some things for the naming convention. And if you're creating a component for a user, you have to have the word user or users in it. So we're going to say some user component and go ahead and build that. Whenever I generate a new component, I have to restart Vola. We'll say some user component, control space, and get that imported. Next, we're going to pass down the prop by going colon some dash value is equal to some value. So we're taking this value and we're passing it down as a prop there. Let's split this up and go ahead and Control Alt click that to open it up in the right-hand side. And using some of the stuff that I've got here, actually I might actually keep the defined props. We're going to now comment all of this out. We're going to accept that value, which is some value. So let's go ahead and do that. Some value, which is a string, is going to be sent down to this component here. So let's do that, some value. And then we'll come back here, refresh the page, we get nothing. Let's make some value something. And there we go, now it works. So, you've probably seen this a million times before, where we have this value here, we send it directly down to the component, and then this component picks it up and then spits it out. Now, another thing you might know is that we're not supposed to mutate this property. And that's an important thing. It's important to distinguish the difference between a property you want mutated versus one you don't want mutated. Now, when I say mutated, a better way to describe this is probably that this component here is not going to be responsible for changing that value. Okay, let me say that again. This component is not responsible for changing some value. So, in other words, if I were to do, I'm just trying to think of the easiest way to do this, set timeout and say, hey, in 2 seconds after this has been rendered or this setup has been run, I want you to change some value to something else. So now we can say props here and we'll say props.SumValue is equal to changed. Let's save that. And we'll go ahead and refresh the page. And we can already see that we've got a warning there. So after that 2 seconds, so this failed, so because the target is read only. Basically, Vue is saying, when you pass a prop down, that is read only. The responsibility of changing this prop is on this component here, on index page. Or another way to say that is, on some user component, if you want this value to change, the responsibility is not this component. In fact, the responsibility to change any value passed down to this component is not the responsibility of some user component. It's always going to be the responsibility of the parent. All right, so that might have been a little bit confusing, so let's play around with this a little bit more now. And you can even see we get a red squiggly here saying cannot assign to some value because it's a read-only prop. All right, we're not allowed to change props. What we can do though, so this might raise the question, well, how do we change that prop? And you might think you know this, but you actually might not quite understand the answer to this question because Vue hides a lot of the intricacies of this under the hood to make it easier for you. To change some value, what we actually do is we say, hey, parent, okay, we send an event from this component to the parent and say, I want you to change some value. Okay, so this component tells the parent that it wants some value to change. And then the parent goes, okay, I'm going to change that for you. It changes some value. And now that it's changed, it gets passed down, all right? So some value gets passed down here, and therefore it changes on this component as well. All right, let me simplify what I just said there. This component tells the parent to change some value. The parent changes it. Now that it's changed, it gets passed down through the prop here. That change gets noticed, and therefore it updates here in the h1 tag. Okay, so if you understand what I just said then, you might need to rewind it and listen to it 5, 10, or however many times it takes. If you understand that flow, that this does not change any of its props ever, it tells the parent to change it, the parent changes it, and therefore it goes down and those changes get noticed on this component. If you can understand that, it basically helps you understand how the composition API reacts with component, or basically how reactivity works at a component level. All right, so make sure you really understand what I've just described there. Okay, so how do we change this? How do we change this value? The correct way to do it is to then say const emit is equal to define emits. All right, and then we pass through an event here. I'm going to do everything in TypeScript here. Because this is a more advanced video and this is what I tend to teach my students. And so if you're watching this, I'm going to be teaching this through the lens of what I want my students to know. So it might not be the video for you. Probably should have said that at the start. Too late. Okay, so we put in here the name of the event. And let's just call this, I'm gonna give it a wrong name for now, but then I'll tell you how to name it correctly. And no, let's do it right from the beginning. So some value colon no, sorry, I've written that wrong. Update colon some value. So this is the correct nomenclature for changing this. We say the name of the prop, some value, and we put the word update. So update colon and then the name of the thing that we want to change. Okay, so in this set timeout, what we're going to do now, instead of changing the value, which we're not allowed to do directly, is we're going to say, hey parent, I want you to update some value. And by the way, I want you to make the text of that changed. Okay? Let's go ahead and, oh, the other thing I need to do is send a payload here. So we need to type this, and we're going to type that as a string. Okay, so tell the parent, send an event to the parent that I want to update some value, and the thing that I want to change it to is changed. Now we can accept that event here. So if I do an @ symbol, you can see we've got update some value. We're getting that typed here. taking that value, so that's the payload here, or in other words, it's this value here changed. So take that new value, and then I want to say some value is equal to val. All right, so let's go through this again now that you can actually see the code for this. Some value, which is a ref, a reactive ref, some value gets sent down to this component. It gets picked up here in the props. Now, after 2 seconds, we send an event to the parent. We say, hey, parent, I want you to update some value and change it to changed. Now, technically, the parent could do nothing here, by the way. It might actually ignore that and just do, nothing at all. We might not have this at update event. And I'll give you an example of that. Let's just put that down here, save it, refresh the page. And after 2 seconds, nothing happened. All right, it doesn't have to respond to this event. But now what we're doing is we're listening for that event, and we say, okay, whenever I get this event of update some value, I'm now going to take that value, the new value, and I'm going to change my version of some value to whatever was passed through. So take what was passed through, in this example changed, gets sent there as a parameter. Now some value gets equaled to that new value. Now that this has changed, okay, so now keep in mind that some value is now equal to the text changed. It gets sent down as a prop to some value. It gets picked up here. Therefore, it gets changed in the template as well. And hopefully you're starting to see throughout this whole progress that a lot is happening here. This is a lot of architecture, a lot of code just to change a bloody value. So now let's come back here, refresh the page and see if that works, see if I've done it correctly. And there we go, changed. Okay, so this is probably starting to feel a bit convoluted, like I just mentioned. And the problem is we want this architecture, for reasons I won't go into in this video, we want to have this architecture which basically draws a line between these two components. It gives us the most flexibility in our apps and makes it easier to develop sustainable apps into the future. And as I said, that goes beyond the scope of this video, but it's important that things happen this way. It's actually been done differently in the past. And what people found, what devs found, was that we want to have an architecture like this to keep things decoupled. Otherwise, our code doesn't scale. Now, one of the cool things is we might choose at this point, we can actually tap into how this gets changed. So in here, it's all lower. It's got a capital at the start, and then it's all lowercase. And what you might decide to do is make the whole thing capitalized. I can't even remember how to do that, to be honest, but it might be like to uppercase. Yeah, there we go. So now if we refresh the page, 1, 2, it's all uppercased. And that's just a really tiny example of what this architecture gives us. It means that we can tap in to this update event and then say, okay, let's make this all uppercase. And we can do anything here. We can then say, hey, when this update event occurs, send a request to the backend and then change this value. Right? So there's different things that we can do. We have total control over the flow of our data here. Okay, now that I've spoken that to death, the next thing I'm going to show you is a simpler way to do this, or a quote-unquote simpler way. And this was kind of the next thing that happened in the community, and this approach is a little bit, I'm going to show you a naive approach to this. Anyway, I'm talking too much, so let's just go ahead and see what it'll look like. So what you can now do is create a computed. So you might say, or a writable computed. So you might say const some value is equal to computed. Again, I don't have to import that because the template I'm using automatically imports this for me. And we can have a getter and a setter for a computed. So you actually can write to computed properties, but you do that by having a getter and a setter. And to be honest, I've actually forgotten the syntax for this. So I might even have to quickly jump into view, getter, setter for computed properties to remember how to do this syntax, because I haven't done it in so long, because as I'm going to show you later on, is we don't actually need to do this anymore. So computed, you can, okay, that is correct. You can say get and set. So we can come in here and now say, if I want to get this value, then I want you to return props dot some value. All right, so if you want to read some value, if you want to read this this computed property, maybe I should rename this actually to some value computed so you don't get confused. So if you want to read that, this is how you do it. And if you want to set that, then we accept the value, which is going to be a string. I might even type it here as well. And what we actually do to set this is we emit an event to the parent. So we say emit to the parent, update some value using the new value. Now what actually happens here now is when this value is read, so when I say some value computed dot value, it uses the getter. But if I try and change it like this, if I say some value computed dot value is equal to changed, what it does is it doesn't actually set the variable. By running this command here behind the scenes, it actually calls this function. So this function gets called, and it's exactly what I was talking about before. It now emits an event. That event gets picked up on the parent. Some value gets changed to the word changed. And now some value gets sent back down to this component. And now some value gets picked up on the getter because this is reactive, right? So now this is now returning the change to the change value, and therefore, so let's just pass that through. Some value computed is now equal to the change value. You might want to watch that again, as I mentioned before, but if you already watched what I was talking about before, you're probably starting to understand this. So this is what a lot of people started to do in the Vue community. They created this computed getter, and now if I refresh the page here, you notice it's equal to change. Let's get rid of that two uppercase thing. But now, the good thing about this is we can now model this. So I can come in here and say q-input, and I can say vmodel some value computed, all right? So I can't model the prop. Let me just quickly show you that. If I were to try and model the prop, again, we're now trying to change the prop directly. You cannot change a prop. So any props being passed down here, you're not allowed to change them, right? That's why we get the red squiggly, and that's why I think this actually might not even work. Yeah, so you'll see that when I click away, it reverts back to the original value. Now, however, let's just get rid of this line of code as well. But this we can model, because when vmodel tries to change some value computed, it's not actually changing the value. It's calling this event, all right? That's the key. We're not changing this value. We are submitting an event to the parent. The parent changes the value. Therefore, it changes here, and then it gets passed down as a prop, blah, blah, blah. You've already heard me say that a million times. So now we come back here and type a new value in there. It works. And this is the thing. Developers get confused by this because if you don't understand what's happening behind the scenes, you might think to yourself, oh, I'm changing some value computed. This is what everybody thinks when they're first using Vue, unless they are very diligent in reading the documentation and understanding the intricacies of it. Most people will think this is what's actually happening. It's not. We're not changing this value. We're telling the parent that there was a change, and then the parent changes the value. And that's how you can start doing cool things like this. To uppercase. And now, as I type in here, even though I'm not holding caps lock, it automatically becomes uppercased. So we're able to do that because we can essentially, quote unquote, hijack this variable as we make the change. Okay. Really make sure that all of this makes sense before moving on, because I want to make sure you've got this foundational knowledge before I show you the next thing. Now, what happened was we then got Vue use. So Vue use comes along And I'm pretty sure there are other libraries that did this before VueUse, but this is where it was a little bit more popularized. And VueUse said, VueUse is basically a library of composables. Okay, so it makes common tasks easy when you're using the composition API. And this is an example of that, right? It turns out that this is actually a very naive implementation, and there's a lot of finicky things that you might kind of want to play with and change around. So VueUse said, you know what, we're going to handle all of the edge cases around this and make all of this a whole lot easier for you. So I might have added it already, but let me just quickly check my package.json. I'm pretty sure it's part of the modular quasar template, and it is. So we already have VueUse. So now what we can do is import useVModel from @vueuse.core. Essentially, this is a shortcut for writing this code here, but it's not naive. It handles a few other things like some reactivity problems that you can run into from memory. But anyway, you don't need to know that. Basically, it abstracts, it makes it so you don't have to write all of this code here. So now I can say const some value, and let's just call this think. Really, you could also call it computed or whatever. Let's call it some value sync. And then we can say use vmodel, and we pass it through the props. And we pass it through the key. All right, and the reason we pass it the key is because it knows which prop to pull from and what to call the event. And we also pass it through emit. From memory, we don't actually have to pass it through emit, but I like to be explicit. And what this means is that we can now model some value sync. We come back here, that's all still going to work, but the code is a little bit simpler now. Let's just see if we can get rid of this. I actually can't remember if it then like defines the emit for us behind the scenes. And when this is typing as well, so we can pass through string there. Or maybe we don't have to. No, it automatically types it for us based on props in the string. Let's try that. Yeah, okay, so you don't even have to pass through an emit. So it looks like it might actually define this for us behind the scenes. But the point is, you know, you can make your code a whole lot simpler. Now, by the way, I'm actually just going to go back a little bit to our computer example because there's one more thing I wanted to show you. This is very key as well. Passing through some value and responding to an event in this way, we can actually shorten that to v-model : some value is equal to some value. All right? So all of that code there, passing the value down and responding to it when it changes, we have a shorthand for that, which is vmodel. So when we're modeling the data, I want you to think behind, I want you to actually see this in your head whenever you do vmodel. I want you to see that update event without the two uppercase part. And I want you to see some value being sent down, because that's actually what's happening behind the scenes here. There might be some slight changes. Again, maybe there's some things they do for performance. I actually don't know, to be honest. I've never dug that deep. But this is what's happening behind the scenes, essentially, behind the curtains. All right, so if I save that, that's still going to work. And the reason it works is not because we're literally, is because we have this update event behind the scenes being attached to some user component. All right, you need to understand that's what vmodel is actually doing if you want to be able to tackle some more advanced concepts with Vue. Okay, so now that you know that, I'm actually going to leave that and leave this commented up the top so that you can always see it and sort of revert back to it, so that in your head, when you pause this video, you can see what's actually happening there. Okay, so now that you know all of that, let's go back here. Let's redo. Oh, maybe I lost everything. That's all right. We can type it out again. So let's say const some value. Maybe we'll even call it some value vmodel. What I actually do, yeah, you know what? I'll show you what I actually do in the real world. I usually just use the word some value. So I essentially rename this prop so that some value is now equal to the reactive version of some value. Okay. vmodel it there, and we're back to what we had before. We don't actually need that emits event. Refresh the page, and that all still works. Okay, so now the Vue community for quite a long time now has been discussing, they had a big discussion around defined props, this macro here, because defined props, as you might know, is this is actually a special macro that writes code for us. So it's a shorthand, and it allows us to use TypeScript here, and then it writes the code behind the scenes for doing defined props. In fact, the whole of script setup is actually kind of like a quote-unquote macro, and it essentially turns this into code behind the scenes, but it makes it easier to write. You might even remember how we used to have to do something like export default. A lot of you might even still write code like this. I can't even remember how to write it anymore. And then you put setup in there like that, and then you do a return, blah, blah, blah. We don't have to do any of that anymore. So essentially, this just makes it easier to write code. And this is another example of that. Defined props is a macro, which means that it gets converted to code for us for dealing with props behind the scenes. You actually don't need to know that. You can even forget that I just said that, but it's kind of a cool little tidbit to know. So we've got defined props, we've got defined emits. This makes things easier. But there was this one niggling thing that was in the community for a long time. And this was one of the things that annoyed me about Vue. And this is one of the things that the Vue community has been talking about a while, which is the best we've got for keeping things in sync is to define the props, to define the emits, to define all the props, and then use this use vmodel composable. And it's okay, but it felt like we could do better. All we want to do is keep this value in sync with the parent, all right? Now, the problem with that is that you lose the knowledge of everything I just told you then. You lose the knowledge of what's actually happening behind the scenes. But the benefit of that is that there's just so much code that you can delete if we were to be able to just say, look, just give me a variable so that I know that whatever this is the same as what that is, right? Just get rid of all this crap around the edges, and abstract that to behind the scenes. And to solve that problem, it was actually solved a long time ago with something called Vue Macros, which is this really, really cool library that allows you to add your own macros, some other macros that were created by another guy in the Vue community. He's actually part of the core team. So he solved this a while ago by adding his own macro. But then just recently in Vue 3.4, we got a new macro that solves this problem. Okay, so check this out. If I say const sum value is equal to define model, we have this new macro called define model. It won't work unless you're in Vue 2.3. So in 2.3, it is experimental. So you'll get a warning in the console when you run your dev server. But in Vue 3.4, it's no longer experimental, so you won't get that warning anymore. But now, anyway, we can say now define model. We have to give it a name, which is some value. And then we can come in here and say whether or not it's required. And usually, I almost always say required is equal to true. But there might be some situations where you want to say, you can model this if you want, but you actually don't have to model it. So now I can get rid of that. I can get rid of all of that. And we can just model it like this. Now, it looks like I'm doing something wrong here. Okay, so I want to type this as well. So we can come in here and say, by the way, that's a string. And that's it. Now, we come back here, refresh the page, everything works. How cool is that? So this is something I wanted for so long, that I used to bring in the Vue Macros plugin because I love this syntax so much. And the reason this syntax is really important is because one of the reasons that developers don't abstract components, that they don't pull their components apart, is because of this problem here, keeping values in the child component in sync with the parent component. Okay? And I want you to know that the important thing to know here is that this is the same code as what I showed you before. This is not actually changing the prop sum value. When we change this, it actually emits an event, as I mentioned before. That event then changes some value. In this case, it's some value to whatever the new value is. That gets passed down as a prop. That prop gets picked up here, okay? So this is abstracting a lot of that logic, and then it gets sent through there. So what's actually happening here in this V model is we're changing some value. In fact, we can even do it here. We can say at update model value. Okay, that's another thing I need to show you quickly. If you were to do a normal V model without this colon, okay, that's another way of saying V model colon model dash value. All right. However, instead of having to write model dash value all over the place, which is a really sort of ugly API, what Vue did was it allowed you to just say V model. So V model is the same, it's sugar, in other words, as writing V model colon model value. So now that you know that, we can say V model, and I'll actually change these values here so that you can see what that actually looks like. So by saying V model, I'm actually saying pass down model value, and when this updates, I want you to listen for the event at update model value, okay? So now if I were to come down here, let's change that to the word model value. And let's change that to model value. And that all still works, okay? Changed. Cool. Now this is really important to know, because when you're building your own APIs, let's say, for example, you have a dialogue. You could do something like this. Imagine this is a dialogue. We could say V model show. However, it's a much nicer API to be able to just say V model. A lot of people don't like doing this. A lot of people like to say V model colon show, and they never have a default for V model because they want to be explicit. That's not what I do. I like to have a very simple way by default. But then if there's other things that I want to model, I will then namespace it with the colon. And a classic example that I use all of the time is with dialogues that have a form in them. I'll say V model, and this will be, for example, modeling something called show dialogue. And then I'll have V model form to model the form inside of that dialogue. Okay. And if you're used to watching some of my, to coding the way that I code and how we code for the Blue standard, formerly known as the LSD standard, it would look something like this. User creator dot form dot value would be modeled there. And then this would be user creator dot show dialogue dot value. Anyway, let's go away from that tangent and bring us back to what we had before. Remember, V model is the exact same as saying V model model dash value. Okay, but we're going to get rid of that for now. And I just want to show you that it's the exact same with other components that we use from libraries. So you don't have to say V model here. You could actually say colon model value. And if I save that, we actually can't change this value anymore. And the reason we can't change that value is we're no longer listening for the update event. Okay, the model value gets sent down. However, we're not listening for what happens when it updates, because remember, V model is not just sending the value down, it's adding a listener so that it knows when model value changes, all right? So let's send through, let me just bring that back to what we had before. And now we could say at update model value, take in the new value, and then I want you to say model value, because remember we've got this defined model here, is equal to the new val that was passed through there. And it doesn't know this is a string, so what you could do is put that in parentheses and put that as a string. All right, and it's saying that it might not be a string that you get, so that's okay. You know, maybe you just type this as any at this point. You could probably find a better way to deal with that with TypeScript. So let's just come back here and notice that that does actually still work. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that this is going to work on other components as well, which is good news because you might have something like QImport, and you might be modeling that value using just vmodel, but maybe you want to make it a capital. And the best way to do that, what people will often do is they end up adding a watcher, and then they end up having two values, which means they've got two sources of truth, and they listen for when one value changes, and then they change another value, and it just becomes really messy. No, if you want to make this a capital, if you want to like make this all capital case and tap into it, the way to do that is to still have one source of truth, which is model value, and then say model value is equal to value, and then at this point we just say to uppercase like that, refresh the page, and there we go. And there are some situations where you might not want to do it at this level. You might want to actually say, at this level, I don't care about the casing, but at this level, I do care about the casing, all right? So, for example, if this component was called my all uppercase input, so maybe for some reason you want to have a component that is just dedicated to making sure the input is uppercase. That's probably not a good idea to do that, but just as an example. Then in that example, if this is called uppercase input, you would do it here. This is where you would change it to all uppercase, all right? Or maybe you've got like an attribute where you can, like a prop where you can say all uppercase, and if that prop is set, then you do it all uppercase, otherwise you don't, right? It doesn't matter. So in that case, you might do it here, but if you have a normal input and you want to make it all uppercase, then you would actually do it at this level. And then that would be a normal V model, V-model equals model value. Save that. Change this to some value because that's what we're actually changing here. And there we go. It's still all uppercase, but it's important to know that I'm doing this in a different place. You want to make sure that you're doing your transformations of data, that you're dealing with data where it needs to be dealt with. All right. So often you don't want that kind of a change to happen low in your component tree. You want to be able to do those data manipulations higher in your component tree. That's where you end up getting trapped. And that's one of the reasons that this way of developing, this view way of using props and emits to change values is important, so that you can always change the value where it needs to be changed. All right. And vModel allows you to do that. You can always go one more level of complexity and tap into the event itself. So it's really good for architecture. Okay, so hopefully all of that makes sense and it sort of gives you an idea. Now, one more thing I want to explain, which is important, is choosing between props, normal props versus vModel. So when we use define model, I like to think in my head, this component is responsible for changing that value. Or it's one of the things that's responsible for changing that value. All right. So in this example, I can change it here, and then it will update on the component. So for example, if we say set timeout, and we change it here, 1500, we say some value equals I am changed. Save it, refresh the page, 1, and it changes for us. The reason that works is because this value changes. Therefore, it gets sent down to model value. It gets picked up here. And I want you to see it in your head. I want you to see that code that I wrote before in your head here, where we're actually, this is the same as writing define props and then passing your prop down of model value, and that's equal to a string. And it's also the same as, also having your define blah, 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 having your define emits in there, and then saying, I'm even going to do all of this because I want you to really understand what's happening here. And returning void, and then saying event is equal to update model value. This is what we've written here is the same as doing all of that. And, having then, that computer that I showed you before, where you could have a computer that watches for the changes in this value, blah, 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 blah. Try and imagine all of those concepts I showed you before when you see model value, all right? So what happens is some value changes, therefore it triggers an update on this component, and now model value changes on this input as well, okay? And that's why it works, and it changes to I am changed. Okay, so you can do it there, but you can also do it here. Let's just steal that code. Come down here. This component is also responsible for changing that value. Refresh the page. I am changed. And notice it's all caps there. The reason it's all caps, okay, this will sort of test your knowledge now, is because the first time we did it, some value got changed and it got sent down and it was not all caps. Whereas in this example, some value got changed, it triggered this update event, and as that event was triggered, we changed it to all caps. All right, see if you can wrap your head around that one. All right, so I'm just trying to think of anything else I need to add in here. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's what define model is actually happening. And I call this the ultimate abstraction because it makes your code way, way simpler, but it doesn't take away any of the flexibility that you need. The best abstractions to me are the ones that slowly pluck away at concepts. So you have, you know, what Vue used to be, which was something that took a lot more code to achieve what you needed. And you slowly, and I say slowly because you want to make sure you're making the right decisions, you add layers on top. You go, okay, how can we make this a little bit easier? How can we make this a little bit easier? And you keep going up the chain until you get to the point where you've got something like this. Model value, and then, you know, it works. Now, I'm going to give you an example of this in the real world. I remember the other thing I wanted to show you. So we want to know the difference of when we would model a value and when we would just send a prop down, because that often confuses people too. Why don't we just use define model for everything? And the reason is sometimes we don't want the value to be mutated on this component. Usually, we actually don't want it to be mutated, all right? Now, a good example of that is a dialog. The dialog itself should know how to close itself. So if we have a dialog that's got a close button, in fact, I'm going to do a full example for this because this will give you a good example of, you know, when you might use these principles. So I'm going to add a Q card in here, a Q card section inside of there to add some padding. Actually, maybe we'll get rid of the section because that's not how I do it in the real world. We'll add a Q toolbar, Q-toolbar-title. And what I'm going to do is say interface props. And I'm going to save that and rename this component to B dialog. B is another word for base. So for me, B means base dialog. Copy that. And this has already been updated in my index page now, so that's nice. Thank you, Vola. And we'll call this, let's make sure that this is called B dialog here as well. Just got to make sure you don't change it there because the folder name is still called some user component. Okay, so we're going to receive a prop here, which is the title. We'll make that a string. I've realized there are actually a few more things I still need to teach you. Define props, and we're going to receive props there. And by the way, you could send this directly through like that. I like to have them separate because it means I can easily export these props if I need to. There we go. And I want to be very realistic to what I do in the real world. So the other thing I usually do, I just copied the B dialog name there, is export that as B dialog props. And then we'll pass that in there. Looks like my lint is upset, so I'm just going to restart Vola. And there we go. So the reason title is not using define model is because the title is not supposed to be changed for the dialog. The dialog should not be responsible for changing the title. And you want to make sure that the parent, as much as possible, you want the parent to be the one in charge of changing the data. All right? It should change the data. That's what gives you flexibility in your apps. It should be the one that changes data that then gets passed down. All right? So if we want the title to change for whatever reason, index page in this example changes it, and then B dialog picks up on that. All right, so I'm probably going to make this optional because that's what I do in the real world. And that should go away in a second because I've now made that optional. And in the toolbar, we've got a title. So let's just crack that open and we'll whack the title inside of there. So save it. And the other thing I'm going to do is add a button. So I'll leave that comment there because it's helpful. Q button. And we'll give that a label equal to show dialog. And when we click on this, we'll say show dialog is equal to true. And let's go ahead and make that variable. I'm going to copy paste that down, show dialog, and whoops. Don't know how I did that. Let's go ahead and make that a variable. We'll make it false by default. And then on B dialog, we're going to model that. So let's get rid of all of this and go back to the simple example now. V model is equal to show dialog. Okay. And that's given us an error because this is supposed to be a Boolean now. So model value is now going to be a Boolean. So I'm going to change the type there. And notice model value isn't doing anything. I'm not using that at all. It's just sitting there. That's why we get the yellow squiggly. So if I refresh the page and click on that, nothing happens. So now Q dialog behind the scenes, it uses vModel to know whether or not it's visible. In fact, let me show you something quickly. If I say model value is equal to true here, right, that's going to show that dialog by default. And if I set that, so we can just send the prop directly down. But what we actually want to do is say vModel. And what we're doing now is we're saying, hey, Q dialog, whenever this value changes, I want to listen for that. All right. And when it changes, therefore model value changes, therefore show dialog changes, and it gets updated. So let's refresh the page. And there we go. Now that works. I really want to drill this home, so I'm even going to rewrite this for you to show you the raw way that we can do this. Colon model value is equal to model value. And by the way, what you might want to do here is change the name of that variable. So this tells us how we model that variable, because remember, this is vModel colon model value. So model value here is telling us how to listen for the changes in that value, right? So if this were, for example, form, then we would set that equal to form, right? But in this example, we're using model value. Forgot where I was going with that. And now we can say at update colon model value. So hey, dialog, when you get that event to update the value, I'm going to set my model value equal to true. And that's right. I was telling you that I was basically wanted to say you can actually change this now to show dialog. Okay. So I want you to know that this variable name has nothing to do with the name of what we're modeling here. That is what we use. Okay. So this first parameter is what we use to name it. And then we can just rename it to something more sensible on this component. All right, so now I can change these to show dialog, refresh the page, show dialog, and that works still. Update. I'm setting that to true. Really what I'd actually do is set that equal to the opposite of what it currently is. So, right, so I'm just negating that. Let's try that again, and it works. Okay, so I'm just going to keep drilling these concepts. Now, show dialog is something that's reactive because Q dialog is in charge. It needs to know when those updates occurs. It needs to have that responsibility because, for example, if I click outside of here, right, then the Q dialog component needs to yell out, hey, I'm closing, right? So it needs to be responsible for changing model value. The title, this dialog doesn't need to be responsible for changing the title. Unless, let me just give a weird example here. if you were able to model that title, so maybe for some reason you got some sort of a dialogue where you can change the title of the dialogue, v model is equal to title. In that case, what you might actually do is you would say title, you would model title here. And then here we would say v model colon title. Okay, so these two need to match, is equal to dialogue title. Okay, so just wanted to give you a silly example there, and then we'd say const dialogue title is equal to ref, and maybe it's nothing by default. And we make this a string to make TypeScript happy. Duplicate key title, and it's saying that because I've also used the props there. So there we go. Now let's open this dialog, and we've actually got a title that we can type in there, all right? The important thing to know here is that title, again, now I want to show you the opposite of this because it's going to look a little bit different now. If I want to listen for updates to the title here, right, we can say title is equal to dialog title, all right? So we can send it directly down. Now when I make changes and click out of it, oh, that shouldn't work. Why is that working? Hang on, give me a quick tick to make sure that's all saved. Refresh the page. Let's just add some space in this dialog. So I've got something to click on. Oh no, that's clicking outside of it. Ah! Dialog title is being sent down there. And then we model the title. Okay, to be honest, I'm not sure why that's working. It actually shouldn't, because when we change title, we're essentially, we're not listening for those changes on the dialog, which is why I would assume that, oh, okay, so maybe it's changing on the form, but it's not actually changing on the parent. So let's do this as an experiment. I actually didn't know that. If I put a pre-tag in here and go dialog title, when I make those changes, notice that dialog title doesn't change. Let's set it to something basic by default. But when I make changes here, it doesn't actually update. And that's because, so what I just discovered, by the way, is that this value will change, but it won't alert the parent. So now when we do this model, the title changes, and let's come in here and say at update title. That's how we listen for the update. And now we can say, let's take that new value, dialog title is equal to that new value. Now it works, changed. And there we go. You can see it changes there as well. Cool, and get rid of that little squiggly thing I did. And I get rid of that as well. So hopefully that sort of gives you a little bit more of a deeper understanding. And I wanted you to know that this is what's happening behind the scenes with, you know, v model colon title. All right, it's basically us modeling something more specific. All right, we'll get rid of that code. And let's actually comment it out up here, just in case you want to have a little cheeky look at that as we keep going. And I'm actually going to go back to our original code and send through the title there. And we'll call this some title. We don't need the colon because we're just sending it down as a string. And then we don't want define model. This is how you would actually do it in the real world. And we'll just whack in the title there. So do you understand why I did that? The reason we're using props here is because the dialogue would not be responsible for changing the title. It doesn't make sense for a dialogue to know how to change its title. But it does make sense for it to know how to close itself. So now what we can do, by the way, is we can say q-button here, and I'm going to make it flat, round, icon is equal to MDI close. And by the way, when you click on that, show dialog is equal to false. Let's have a crack at that. And so essentially we've just made a button now that can close that. And this is one of the cool things about define model. Once you've set it up, you can really easily just have this, rest easy knowing that that dialog, this show dialog variable is going to be in sync with model value on the parent. All right. And again, we don't need colon model value there because this is sugar for colon model value. Okay. Another example is color. If I wanted to give this a color, let's think about this for a second. If I give it a color, should the dialog know how to change its color, or should that happen on the parent? For me, the answer is almost always yes, but the answer is almost always the parent. So the parent should be in charge of changing the color. And now we'll say the color is equal to, and we don't need the colon there. Let's just say orange. And now let's go ahead and accept that. And I'm going to add another layer of knowledge on here for you. Quasar has actually got a named color type now. So this type allows us to essentially type Quasar's colors. So now, if I do control space there, we get all the Quasar's colors. How freaking cool is that? Yeah, so we say we want a color, and let's go ahead and use it. So I'm going to say class. Oh, I think you can do background color. No. So we'll say colon class is equal to, and we'll say color, say bg dash color to set the color of the toolbar. Show dialog, it's orange, and maybe you have another one for text color. So text dash color. Let's go ahead and make that white. And now let's come in here and we can say text color, which is also a named color. And we'll say here background. Instead of background, we'll make that text dash. Because you might know this BG dash and then the name of a Quasar color is how you is a class that Quasar offers, utility classes that Quasar offers to change the colors of things. And there we go. That's not working. Oh, sorry, that shouldn't be color. That should be text color. There we go. Now, in this situation, what if you want to have a default color and a default text color? So let's get rid of those, save it, and see what happens by default here. So maybe by default, you want to use the primary colors that you have for your app. In fact, this is what I would do. I would want to use my primary color to make sure the text is, the background and the text look nice and follow my theme. So a way you can do that is with defaults. So let's come in here and I'm going to cut this and say with defaults, and I'm going to pass through as the first parameter. By the way, I think this is a macro, a view macro. It might actually be something else. Yeah, here we go. It's a macro that allows you to very easily set defaults in a TypeScript way. So there we go. We pass that through, and as a second parameter, we pass it an object with our defaults. So get in the habit of that, of what I just did there. I'm going to undo it and show you again, talk you through it. Cut define props. And what you might actually have here is const prop. So let's actually do it this way, because there's a lot of situations where you'd have it assigned to props there. Cut that, write with defaults, give it a first parameter of what you just cut, and as a second parameter, you can now give it default values. As a default, I'm going to set the title equal to nothing. As a default, by the way, to open that, you might know this already, but if I do control space, that's how I get that menu of all the typings that I've got there. As a default, I want to set the color equal to primary. Because if I do bg-primary, that sets it to the primary color for my app. As a default, I want to set the text color. I actually want to set that equal to white because I want a primary background and I want the text to be white. So let's go ahead and do that. In this example, props isn't being used, so I'm actually just going to get rid of that. But I wanted to show you it with const props because I didn't want to confuse you with what the final syntax would look like. So let's go ahead and get rid of that for now. Save it. And now we get the primary color and this beautiful kind of white text against the primary color makes it look good by default. We get to use our theming by default. Or maybe you prefer maybe like more of a darky mode feel, in which case you could just switch that and say white and primary. So you could do that as well, whatever you want for your application. Actually, that would be light mode, not dark mode. What am I saying? Okay, so that's another layer of complexity there for you to work with. The last thing I want to talk about is something that I call hijacking props, okay? Now, if I were to get rid of show dialog here, okay, this is a difficult one to explain. Just give me a hot second. I'm not cutting up this video, so I understand you're waiting. Maximize, let's use that as an example. I think it's maximized, yeah, with a Z. I get confused because in English it's spelled with an S, or at least in Australian English. So let's try that now. Cool. Now, if I were to pass through to B dialog maximized, M-A-X-M-I-Z-E-D, press a page. Huh. I spelt it wrong. Huh. Maximized. Notice that that works, okay? Now, this is something called transparent props. By default, if I send through a property here, it goes directly down to Q dialog, all right? If I send a property to B dialog, it gets sent directly down to the root component. In fact, you might have had this problem before. If I add another component here, notice that we actually get a warning. Extraneous non-props attribute maximized. We're past a component. Okay, I'm not even going to read that to you. Basically what it's saying is, you gave me the property maximized. I don't know if let me just pull that apart. I don't know, okay, imagine this from Vue's point of view. Am I supposed to put that here? Or am I supposed to put that here? It doesn't know. How's it supposed to know if you wanted to put it on that component or that component? So if you have two root components, Vue says, look, I don't know what to do with this thing here. I don't know what to do with this extra prop. So I'm going to throw you a warning to say, yo, buddy, I don't know what to do with this prop. Therefore, can you figure out what happens with it, all right? So let's get rid of this div. And if we only have one root element, it gets sent down to this component, all right? So that works with no worries. Now, what we can do, if we were to have another div here, because sometimes you might want that. You might want to have two root elements. I almost never do. I'll wrap it all in a div if it comes to that, but I don't know what your use case is. Sometimes I think with labels and inputs, people do this. But anyway, what you might want to do is have like a div at the bottom here and then a component at the top. And in that case, you can say v-bind is equal to $adders. Now, $adders is basically saying, take all of the attributes that were passed to B dialog. Actually, I don't think that's true. Give me a hot second so I can just clarify what I'm about to tell you, make sure it's true. Yeah, okay. Give me all of the attributes that this component doesn't know how to deal with, okay? So in other words, don't give me the model value because I've already said, by saying define model, I've said, hey, Vue, I'm taking control of this property. By adding title here, we're saying Vue, I'm taking control of title. I'm taking control of color. I'm taking control of text color. Whenever we add a prop or whenever we add a defined model, we're saying to Vue, do not manually pass it down. Basically, we're saying I am now completely responsible for that property, okay? Don't do anything automatic with that property, in other words, okay? So if we don't do v-bind adders and we don't have the div, okay, none of these get sent directly down to the dialog. Maximized, because I'm not doing anything with that prop, it automatically gets sent directly down to QDialog. So behind the scenes, Vue is doing this. Maximized is equal to $adders dot maximized. Of course, the code probably doesn't look exactly like that. I think that might even still work. Yeah, so that's what Vue is actually doing behind the scenes. And we call this transparent props. Okay, it's automatically sending that prop down to the component. Now that I've spoken that to death, I just want you to understand that nuance. Okay, whenever we add in define model, we're saying I am now going to be in charge of model value. Don't do anything automatic with it. Okay. Now the other thing is, what else was I getting at here? Yeah, okay, so now that we got maximized on there, we click on the dialog and it's maximized. However, if I add a prop in here called maximized and do nothing with it, so let's add it as a Boolean there, and it's just going to sit there. We might even give it a default value. Maximize is equal to, maybe by default it's actually equal to true. Okay, so maybe you want all your dialogues in your app to be maximized by default, and therefore you create a base dialog with maximize equal to true by default. Okay, now let's see what happens here. It's not maximizing. So this value is being completely ignored. Why? Because it gets sent down as a prop, and we are telling Vue, I am responsible for this property. Okay? And because we're responsible for it, it doesn't get sent directly down to QDialog by default. If we aren't responsible for it, so if I get rid of that, it now gets sent down to it now gets sent down by default. Okay? So once we say we're responsible for that property, we're now the ones that have to pass it down like this. Okay? So you have to do that extra, if you want to quote unquote hijack this property, and that's what we're doing here. We're hijacking maximize. We're saying, I want to hijack this and set it to true, because Quasar sets it to false by default. I'm now taking control of this property and setting it to true by default. That means I also have to pass it down to QDialog. Refresh the page, and there we go. By default, it's set to true. And now we can do other cool stuff, like maybe in all of your dialogues. And I'm not saying you should do this, by the way. I wouldn't do this. I just want to show you a demo here. You might then say QDialog. I'm going to steal everything there, actually. Not QDialog, Q button. MDI maximize. Have we got like a window maximize icon? We do. And at click, we can now say maximized is equal to true. We actually can't do that though, because we're not modeling maximized. So if you want to be able to control whether or not it's maximized, and that's a common thing you do in your app, you might now say, hey, instead of passing it as a normal prop, we're going to say define model maximized, right? Maximize true. We can still set that to true by default. So that's another thing I want to show you. We can now say default is equal to true. So we have another parameter here with define model with a default value. All right. So this is the same. I want to be clear. This follows the same rules of saying I'm hijacking maximized. I'm now in control of maximize. So if I comment that out, just want to quickly demonstrate. All right, that still doesn't maximize by default. We still have to manually come in here and set it. Right? And now let's click on there, maximized, and that button isn't doing anything. Let me just quickly see what we're doing here. At click, maximize is equal to true. Okay, so now, let me just get rid of it there. Let's set required to false, because you wouldn't want maximize to be required. And there we go. And pushing that does nothing, and I think the reason that does nothing, because I thought from our experiment before that changing this value actually changes it within the context of this component. Sorry, give me a quick second. I want to see if I've written something wrong here. Save that, refresh. Anyway, that's not important. Okay, so now what we can do is we can say v-model maximized is equal to maximized. And then we can say maximized here. And maybe we actually set it to default by default here. So by default, set maximized equal to false. Now that should work. And when we click on that, we can sort of switch between. Oh, I know what I've done wrong now. Okay, let's just roll back. Sorry, I know this part's been a little bit unprofessional. Yeah, so the problem is this is meant to be equal to the opposite of maximized. You probably saw that. I bet you saw that. All right. So this is cool. That's probably why Vue made the decision to make it so that you could alter this variable even if it's not being modeled on the parent. So now what I can do is say, yo, if you don't give me a maximize variable, I'm just going to make my own. I bet you that's what Vue is actually doing here. It says, if you don't give me a variable to model, I'm going to create my own maximized ref. And now we can change that value here. And it works, right? Or we got all these options now. Or we can say maximize is equal to false. And we send that directly down. Okay, so we can do that. We can say maximize is equal to true, and we send that directly down. Okay, and that works. We can v-model maximized. Actually, mized. Where's my maximized value? Oh, it looks like I got rid of it. Here we go. And we'll set that equal to false by default. Right, so not only do we have this maximize button on our dialog, we can now sync that maximize button with the parent. So I can have like a pre-tag here that just tells us whether or not it's maximized. And a good example of that, right? So notice that set it to true. So the parent now has knowledge of whether it's maximized. And the cool thing about this is you might want to have an option in your app. Again, this is a bad example, but you might want to be able to have a configuration in your app that says whether or not all of the dialogues are maximized. So you could then say q-checkbox, v-model is equal to maximized. And maybe this is like a global variable. And let's put a label on this saying maximize dialogues. Make sure I spelled that right. So they don't maximize, but then if I tick that, they do maximize. Okay, so hopefully you can see that where v-model comes in is when you actually want to model something on the dialogue itself. Now I know the best example. I wasn't thinking straight before, now I am. But this example was a good kind of segue. The best example of this is when you have a form on the dialogue as well. So you want to be able to model whether or not you show the dialogue, and you also have a form on that dialogue. And I do this all the time, especially if you generate forms. You might actually want to go one level deeper and have a, for example, B form dialogue component, because you follow that pattern so many times and it always looks the same for you. You might want to be able to do that. So let's come in here and say const form. I'm going to show you how to do this, and then we'll finish up this video. Let's make it a ref, and it's going to have a name. I want to have an interface for this as well. Interface, and let's call this a user form. They've got a name, which is a string, and an email, and an age. And that's actually going to be a number. We have a form ref, which is the user form, And then we'll say the age is equal to 0 by default, email, an empty string, and the name is an empty string. So now we've got a typed form. And maybe we now want to model that form on the dialog, right? The way some people teach to do this is to always use the inside of the dialog. By the way, we never finished building this dialog, so let's quickly do that. We'd also come down here and we'd say like a Q dash, no, let's just make it a div. And then we'd say slot to use the default slot there. And I think that's it. Let's just see if that works. Yeah, there we go. And then inside of here, I would then say Q card section, and that's where I'd put my content. Cool. Okay, so you could just put your form directly in here. However, the reason I don't do this is because since I've done it so many times, I've now come up with some patterns for simplifying this by using form generators. I actually recommend that you do put your forms directly into your dialogues until you've got a really solid idea of how you might do it differently, of how you might abstract this concept. But since you're watching this video, there's a good chance you'll be using some of my libraries in the future. And my libraries do actually allow you to model the form on the dialog in some scenarios. And actually, the other thing is abstracting components. So what I would recommend you do is put your forms inside your components. So you might have a create user dialog, for example, and I would put the form in that dialog. I actually wouldn't put it inside of the template here. Yeah, so anyway, more on that later. And what we might actually do is rename this to make the example more realistic. So I'm just going to quickly rename this to create user dialog. All right, I'm going to grab that name, change that to create user dialog, and then change this to create user dialog. And I'm going to simplify some things a little bit by getting rid of a lot of these concepts that we have here. Maximized, I'm going to leave show dialog, get rid of that. And quickly restart Vola there. I think that'll do. So what I want to be able to do, let's do the API that we want first. Oh, we'll get rid of the toolbar as well. Yeah, just so you can focus on the code that we actually need to write in this example. And that's going to be a Q form. This is where our form's going to go. Refresh the page and get rid of the checkbox. We still got show dialog. Is that working? Failed to resolve component Q form. There we go. We're back to something simpler now. So what we want to be able to do is model this form on the create user dialog. So let's come in here and say vModel::form is equal to form. That's the API I'm looking for. To me, that is really clean. Now, the reason I want to do this is because I don't want this dialog to be in charge of creating the user. I want the parent to be in charge of creating the user. So and there's a lot of reasons you want to do that go beyond the scope of this tutorial. But basically, if you want to be able to hijack fields or add things to your form as you're creating the user, that's much harder to do if you create the user on the dialog, which is why I want to push that logic to the parent and make the parent in charge of doing that. Okay, so we're vModeling this form, and now we can come down here and let's actually export that. So we have that interface and we can access it here. And we're going to say define model. Let me create a little bit of space for this one. And let's call this the form. The type of it is user form. All right, so essentially I've just imported what we've got here. And we call it form. In other words, when I model this, we're going to be, remember this string here lines up with what we pass through to vModel in the namespace there. Okay, so we're modeling form. Yes, it's required. It wouldn't make sense to use this component without it. Therefore, it is required. And I think that's about it. So now we have this fully typed form variable, which is going to be in sync with vModel here, with that variable there. All right, just to prove it's fully typed, form.value dot, and you can see we get age, email, and name. Okay, now I can come in here and say q-input, and we'll say the label is equal to name. Save that, and for the form, we've got name, email, and age. So now I can come down here and say email, come down here and say age, v-model, and I think you can do dot number is equal to form dot age. And there we go. And let's go to these two. Oops, did that wrong. vModel, and in this case, it's form dot name, and in the other one, it's dot email. And for all of them, I want to have field. There we go. Let's see what that looks like. Nice. The other thing I want to do is put this inside of a QCard section, just to add a bit of padding, QCard section, and class is equal to q dash gutter dash margin, dash y is equal to medium. So add a gutter on the y-axis, that's medium. Did that work? Oh goodness, I think I've forgotten. Oh, I put it on the card section. It needs to go one level lower onto the form. There we go. That'll do. Now, because this form, because we're using define model, I want you to think about what's happening here, because you might sort of get lost along the way because we're using an object now, but it turns out it's actually the exact same. Whenever form changes here, and I'm going to go ahead and prove that to begin with, it changes on the child as well. So if I were to say after 2 seconds, form.value is equal, dot email is equal to blah. Let's actually make that 4 seconds to give us a little bit more time. Then form updates. Therefore, the updated prop for form, because remember, behind the scenes, we're doing this. Behind the scenes, we're actually doing :form is equal to that form. All right, so the form updates, it gets received here. And remember, behind the scenes, you want to think of it looking like this. I'm going to write the whole thing out for you. So behind the scenes, this code has also been written, or it actually looks like that when we do define model. Okay, so the form gets accepted in that prop there. Therefore, form is now equal to, at least the email part of form is now equal to blah, and therefore the email will equal blah. Refresh the page, show dialog 3, 4, and there we go, it updates. Okay, so I want you to know that I can now update form.value.email on the parent. Get rid of that. Now I want you to know that whenever form updates, it also updates on the parent because it emits an event to the parent. In fact, let's do this because I want to prove everything I'm showing you now to tie everything together. At update form, give me that value, console.log the value. All right, so let's open that up. Whoop. Oh, sorry, and we're going to pass down the form as a property. Okay, so we're not modeling it anymore. We're just passing down the form as a property. And when the form wants to update, we're not changing it. We're just logging the value. So let's try that. LUKE. Huh, that's not actually working. At update form. Wonder why that is. Oh no, right towards the end of the video. Yep. Let's try one more refresh. Yeah, that's modeling correctly, but it's not triggering an update on model value. So I just went on a little bit of a journey to try and figure out what's been going on here. And it turns out, because of the way define model works, and this is something that's actually been discussed a little bit in the Vue community of when they were creating define model. I'm not going to go into details, but basically, because of the way it works, it doesn't actually emit an event when you're using objects. And I believe that's partly because of performance. So basically, Vue would have to watch, do a deep watch on objects in order to notify the parent, whereas you might not actually want that by default. So what you could do if you really wanted to be able to listen to these updates is add a watcher on the model and put deep on that watcher. I haven't even tested this yet, so let's bloody hope that this works, eh? So we could, for example, watch that form and then say new form here, and then we would have to have an event as well. I don't even know if that'll work. So let's just quickly check this. Define emits. By the way, you would only have to do this if you actually wanted to listen for events, but this is definitely good to know in case you run into this problem. And we could say the event would be event update form, and then the payload, or you could probably even just call it the value at that point, which is going to be user form. And so maybe we could just do a watch on the form, and then we would say deep. You might not even need to say watch deep because it's just one level down. Let's see. Oh, I think it is actually, because otherwise you're just watching dot value. Anyway, let's see what happens. So now I can say emit update form, like so, and then we send through new form. So let's see if that's going to work for us. And we're going to send the form down like so. Okay, I'm not getting any changes, but I reckon if we put deep in here, we'll be able to watch that object and then emit that update event. There we go. So if you do want to be able to essentially listen for updates, this is how you can do it. Otherwise, usually 99.99% of the time, you're probably just going to say vmodel form and model the form like that. I didn't know this, and I'm not 100% sure why that decision was made. With the brief look I looked at, I couldn't figure out why it works this way, but that's totally fine. At least we know. At least we know what's happening here. I do feel a little bit bad though, because I was kind of drilling home this concept of, listening to updated events. And now we find out that the way define model works is a little bit different, and it doesn't actually send that event. It seems to be modeling the values of the object directly, which is causing the changes up here, which isn't a big deal. However, it kind of does break the paradigm a little bit. And that was a couple of the complaints that I saw other people making in the community. It does slightly break that paradigm of sending events, responding to those events, and then sending the value down. Now, keep in mind, this is only for things like objects and arrays. But for example, our model event, this actually is going to work. So if I say update model value, and then we just take the value and we console.log it, then when that gets triggered, notice that we do get that logged, which is why we're getting that false showing up down the bottom there. Okay, so I think that'll do. This is cool. At least I got to learn something new here. And I kind of sat there and scratched my head for probably about an hour looking through posts and trying to figure out what was happening here to try and give you the best information possible. And honestly, I don't have a great answer for you as to why the way it works with define model when you're using an object is a little bit different. Maybe we can do that in a video later on, but honestly, it actually doesn't really matter. And it's probably frustrating for you at this point to get to this, end of the video and have me tell you this. I'm a little bit frustrated myself. I was like, man, why doesn't it just work the same way? And from memory, actually, let's just test this quickly. If you use vmodel, I'm pretty sure that actually works slightly differently. So let's do this instead now. I'm pretty sure we don't even need the emit. Let's do this. Let's just say define props, and we'll pass everything directly down there. And we'll say form is equal to, and that would be user form. And then we'll come in here and say const form is equal to use v model, and we'll pass through the props, and we'll call it form. Oh, sorry, pass through the props, and we'll call it form. And from memory, that's all we need. Okay, there you go. So with use v model, this was actually also the case. I'll quickly test that. What happens if we give it the emits? Const emit equals define emits. And then we'll come down here and we'll say event is equal to update the form. Oh, hang on. I changed what was happening in the dialog. At update form. My bad, I bet you saw that. No, okay, so we are still getting the same result where at update form doesn't seem to be triggered when you're using use v model either. And I wonder if they actually changed that at some point to get in line with the way define model now works. I really don't know. But that's okay. Obviously, I don't know everything, not even close. So let's just try this, just as a sanity check. And you could probably finish up the video now if you don't want to watch me flounder around here. I'm going to return void, and we'll call this event and update form event, and the payload is going to equal the user form. Okay, and now we send through emit. I really don't know why this would change anything, but I'm just kind of curious. Double check that. Update form, make sure it's all spelt correctly so I don't give myself a false negative. Yeah, nothing. Okay, well, there you go. You learn something new every day, that's for sure. All right, I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I enjoyed making it for you. I don't want you to forget everything I said, though, around emitting events, because this is usually the case. I want you to think of this as kind of, this is the exception to the rule, because this is definitely the only situation I've found where that update event doesn't actually get triggered, which is when you're using objects, and that would also be the same for when you're using forms as well. But remember, what you could actually do is you could do a watcher on this if you want those events to be emitted for whatever reason, and then we can then say new value, and we can say emit update form with that new value. And now that we've done that, we do actually get those events being passed through. Ooh, refresh that. Okay, we should be getting those updates passed through. Enter the new value whenever the form changes. Oh, that's right, with deep. I bet you saw that one too. And there we go. All right, hope you enjoyed this one. Hope it was useful, and I'll see you in a future video.